Today on Practical Church Planting, we give you 6 tips for preaching without notes.
Welcome everybody to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsian. Joining me is Dylan Dotson, and today we're talking about 6 tips for preaching without notes.
So 6 tips for preaching without notes. And basically what's going to happen is I'm going to share with you kind of my journey from the beginning of this year to having 5-ish pages, almost a manuscript, pretty much 80% of what I was going to say minus my notes or minus my stories, to recently preaching with 0 notes. And if you had told me even 6 months ago that this would be happening, there is no way I would believe you. And so I'm just going to share with you 6 tips that I implemented to get me to where I am, that hopefully you can probably use some of these to reduce the amount of your notes that you use.
Right.
Everyone's different, so we're not saying you can't use notes at all, but generally speaking, if you can look up more and look down less, you do connect better.
Sure.
And so why not go down this road together?
Why not?
So here are 6
I think there's something that almost every speaker or communicator is like, man, I want to speak without notes.
And so I want to tell you though, like literally 6 months ago, I would have told you this is impossible.
Yeah.
So like it is possible. This isn't someone who's like been preaching for 50 years and be like, well,
sure.
You can kind of roll your eyes. I haven't been doing this forever. We launched a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And I preached before we launched, but not at all like I have the last year and a half. So 6 tips.
Let's see.
Number 1, may sound obvious, but it's very true, is you need to force yourself to take every step. And what I mean by that is every reduction of notes that you use, you have to force yourself to do. So I went from taking 5-ish notes up on my iPad, and I had it horizontal in two columns. Now I didn't read everything, but it was there, and I also found myself looking down more because I could.
Sure.
So the first iteration, if you will, I went from 5 pages to 3 pages, which was nerve-wracking. But you just have to make yourself, it's kind of like having a baby. There's never a good time to do it.
Right.
You just have to do it, right? And so I went from 5 to 3. Then I got comfortable. Then I went from 3 to 1. And then I went from 1 to 0. And every single time, it was nerve-wracking.
Sure.
But I had to make myself do it. Otherwise, it just never would have happened.
Yeah, I think it's easy to constantly say, like, once I get a little more comfortable, I'll do it. But in reality, you're never going to get comfortable taking it away until you take it away.
Right. You're going to be nervous the first time you do it, regardless. And so you just have to realize I'm going to take it. You can't go from, in my case, from 5 to 0. So you've got to take a step.
Right.
But every step will be difficult. You just have to do it.
Sure.
And you'll do it because you won't have a choice.
Yeah.
So that's number 1.
Just do it.
Force yourself to take every step, just like Nike says. Number 2, use a standard outline each week. If you go to episode 32 of this podcast or the show, we talk about a template that we use. Again, real quick, it's setting up attention, and then it's what do they need to know? Why do they need to know it? What do they need to do? Why do they need to do it? And a bottom line. And sometimes you have to tweak that, maybe the order, maybe the questions. I used to kind of think templates or outlines dumbed things down, but then I found myself teaching way too much, and people can't walk away with everything. And so instead of having people guess what the message is about, I just became very clear. And it also, on a side note, helps you preach better and clearer sermons, which we talked about in that episode, because there's a flow to it.
Right.
But anyway, using a standard outline, even though like I don't say the outline out loud as I'm doing each part of the message, it began to help me know the flow of it. So even if I got lost or confused, I kind of do the flow. And now that I've done it enough, I've memorized the questions in my mind. So it was just really helpful to have a standard type of message, even though the messages were different, the texts were different. It was very similar each week, so it helped me kind of get in a routine. Yeah. So whatever that looks for you, I found it to be really helpful.
Yeah, I think one thing that helps with that outline is each kind of question is almost like an anchor point. Like, it might be kind of tough to get to the from one to the what do they need to know, or what do they need to do, but then once you're there, then you can kind of remember where you were.
Exactly.
So it kind of like gives you checkpoints that you can get up to.
Exactly. So again, number 2, use a standard outline each week, episode 32 of the show. You can learn more about it. Number 3, again, this only helps if you're in a place that has screens, but use more slides. So we have TVs, whether it's a projector, whatever it is, use more slides and use the slides instead of notes. Right. So when it comes to kind of this outline, again, having your main points on a screen, what this allows you to do is it allows you to remember. You don't have to memorize your whole message. You just have to remember each point.
Yeah.
And so as you see, the next point, you can read it and you can talk about it, and you can read it and you can talk about it. Instead of looking down at your notes, you're looking at a screen, or in our case, we also have the screen in the back of our auditorium. You might have a safety monitor somewhere too. You just read it and keep going, and you don't have to actually memorize everything, because that was a thing for a lot of us. You're like, how am I supposed to memorize 20, 30, 40 minutes of material?
Right.
I mean, I guess you can, but instead of doing that, if you put more slides on the screens, I would recommend only 1 point per slide. That's a different conversation for another day. If you put a lot of stuff on the screens, people always read the screen before they listen to you. So you want to keep it to a sentence or less every single time. But put some of your points and kind of the progression of your sermon, of your message on the screen, so you don't have to use notes.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. Again, number 3, use more slides and kind of transfer your notes to your slides. Now, that means you do have to know what you're going to say, which will lead me to the next point, but at least it helps you not have to look down every time. You can follow what's on the screen.
Sure.
So that's number 3, use more slides. Number 4 is you have to commit to putting in the work. So I used to think the more experienced I got, the better I would be. And of course, your skill does develop the more you do it. But I just thought, you'll be good, and then you can just talk for forever. Now, you can talk for forever, but if you want it to be intelligible and make sense,
engaging.
The reality is there's really no way around it other than to be honest about you have to put more work in. I put more work in on our messages today than I did when we launched a year and a half ago.
Sure.
Because I'm trying to use them without notes. And it takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more internalization. It takes a lot more going over them because you're not trying to use notes. And if you want it to make sense, again, you can just talk. But if you want there to be a flow to it, you just have to put the work in.
Yeah.
There's really no way around it. And I think, if I'm being honest, this I think is the big reason why a lot of people are afraid or won't do it.
Oh, I'm sure.
Is because they're like, I don't want to put the work in. Now, again, if you go from, again, my example, 5 pages to 0, that's too much. And you're not going to be able to, like that. You're like, that would take forever. It would. But if you slowly, again, take steps and put the work in every time, you'll become more comfortable with it.
Right.
So number 4, again, there's just no way around it. If you want to preach without notes or with less notes, which I think is a great goal, you've got to put in the work.
Yeah, that should be the obvious one, but it's probably the hardest one.
Number 5, you got to be okay with forgetting things. So you could say, well, what if I forget X? Well, the reality is, A, nobody knew you were going to say it.
Yep.
And B, if it was that important, you wouldn't forget it.
True.
Now, I'm not saying that's like, how dare you forget it, or like, there is a very legitimate possibility that you will forget a very important point of your message.
Right.
But the reality is, like, it obviously in that moment or in the flow, it wasn't so important that you remembered it.
Yeah.
And so you just have to be okay with saying, you know what, I'm going to forget things. Nobody's going to get mad at you for preaching less amount of time, and nobody's going to know that you didn't have it. And that's just part of it. Again, I think a lot of times as preachers, we've talked about in previous episodes, you want to teach everything, you think everything is important, and everything is important, but not everyone knows what you're going to say, and it's okay if you forget stuff, because I would argue the ability to connect with the people is outweighs telling them everything you wanted to say.
Yeah, and I've had times like this where I've realized afterwards that I left something out that I really wanted to mention, and got kind of bummed about it, but then when you kind of think over the whole grand scheme of the message, the one thing that you left out, most likely you wouldn't have left it out if it would have made a big impact in the message.
Right. And the funny thing is, at our church, so every Monday I post a blog about 5 or 6 things I saw, felt, and heard, whatever. So I've been sharing on Instagram and my journey about this stuff. And so people have been coming up to me these last few weeks, as I literally 3 weeks ago was the first time I preached with 0 notes.
Yeah.
And I've even said, we are connecting with you better. And, it seems like people that don't use notes, it's not true, but care more about what they're saying. They're more likely to forgive you messing up because they know you're just talking to them.
Yeah.
It's different than like if you stutter or you mess up and you're reading a manuscript and everyone's like, oh, they're like, uh-oh. But when you stutter or you mess up and you don't have, like, nobody thinks anything of it because it's like, okay, and you just keep going. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there seems to be a lot more forgiveness when you're just having a conversation than if you're sitting there and reading something.
Yeah, it probably doesn't seem as much as I don't know. I mean, this might sound bad, but it won't seem as much like a prepared, speech that you're given as much as just preaching and teaching.
So again, number 5, be okay forgetting things. I know that's not easy. Yep. And this is part of, again, there's taking these steps. As you do it and as you realize, oh, it's okay, it's not the end of the world.
Yep.
You'll be more okay with it. But you will forget something. You will literally, if you don't use notes, you will forget something that you wanted to say. And at the end, you will be like, can't believe I said that.
Yep.
And nobody knew you were going to say it. And so it's going to be fine.
Yep. Forgive yourself.
Not easy, but do it. And then number 6, this one's not easy, but is also important, is you have to learn to trust yourself. Mm-hmm. So again, using less notes, you may think like the first week I didn't use any notes. I was like, this is going to take like 15 minutes because I didn't
rush through everything.
Now I was fortunate because we were going over the story of Lazarus. So it was a lot of text that Sunday.
Yeah.
But even since then, it's been fine. But there is a little bit of trust. Like you won't be as good at it when you begin. than if you do it for a long time.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be nervous when you forget something because you're so focused on trying to memorize or remember everything that you won't just be talking. And so it may come across like, oh, I wonder if they forgot something because it seems like, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Like you just have to learn to trust yourself, learn to say something else if you want to, learn to speak less, and it's okay. And it sounds easy. I'm just going to trust myself, but it is hard, which is why, again, I keep going back to point number one is you have to force yourself to take a step every single time. For all of these, it's not easy, but as you trust yourself more and as you go for it more, I would just say this, if you're thinking about using less notes and wanting to use less notes or wanting to use no notes, is that you can do more than you think you can. Like I would say literally that you can do more than you think you can. I'll give you a personal example. The second week, so a couple weeks ago, that I used no notes, in our first service, on the back of our screen, it has the slide that's on the TV and has the slide that's coming up next.
Right.
So I know what everyone's reading and I see what's coming up next. So I don't have to it makes it really helpful. So I know what's coming. So I know where I'm going. So I literally only had my Bible up there. 30 seconds into my message, long story short, the TV stopped working.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I had nothing on stage. Now I missed like 2 of the 8 points or 6 points or whatever.
Yeah.
And I felt terrible about it. Nobody knew.
Yeah.
Nobody could tell. And the reason why nobody could tell was, again, going back to point number 4, is to commit to putting in the work. I put a lot of work into it. But it just really showed me that, yes, second service went way better because the TV didn't go out and I was able to actually go through everything I wanted to go through. I didn't miss anything.
Right.
But it was just a great reminder that nobody knows that there's more forgiveness, if you will, when you're not using any notes because people feel like you're just talking to them.
Yeah.
And it feels more relational to them. And so all that to say, even if it was my second week and I had nothing, like no screens, no nothing. I forgot some stuff, but it was okay. And I think if I was reading something and let's say my iPad turned off, which happened one time, it turned back on. Like it's just a lot more obvious that something's wrong.
Yeah.
And give yourself grace, give yourself patience. And I want to ask you as we go through these 6 things, and we'll recap them again. Force yourself to take every step. Number 1. Number 2, use a standard outline. Number 3, use more slides. Number 4, commit to putting in the work. Number 5, be okay forgetting things. Number 6, learn to trust yourself. You've been here this whole time.
I have.
How would you compare, not necessarily my ability, but from January when I had 5-ish notes, then this summer when I really worked onto it, to now having no notes? Like, what is it from someone sitting and listening?
Yeah.
How has that helped you connect better? What has been your experience with it?
Yeah, one thing I noticed, and I mentioned it a few weeks ago, is that there seems to be a lot more energy coming from the stage, which has a lot to do with the fact that you're not tied to a table in our sense, or a stand or a podium or something like that. That you're not tied to notes, so you can actually have more freedom, not just to walk around and move around, but you have more freedom to use your hands and more freedom to kind of, if something needs to be, I mean, one kind of danger here is that you'll kind of, with no notes, you won't stay focused and go down a rabbit trail and spend 20 minutes on something. But also you have some of the freedom to, if you feel like something needs to be expanded on more, to do so. So that's one thing that I've noticed a lot, is that there seems to be a lot more energy and passion coming from the stage because you're not tied to your notes. It's not a matter of trying to make sure I said this and then move on to this, but it's, hey, if there's some feeling in something, that I can actually explore it a little bit further.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's been really good. One question I have for you before we wrap up: if you're a new communicator, someone's watching this and they're like, I'm just launched, or I haven't launched, or I'm kind of new in this, do I need to go to no notes?
No. Here's what I would say as we wrap up. If you're brand new and you're freaking out, you know what to do. Don't worry about the notes.
Right.
If you go with no notes, you will do bad.
Yes.
Nobody wants to listen to you ramble, and you will do bad. What I would say the most important thing for a new communicator, which is back to point number 2, is to use an outline. Use an outline to help you get comfortable. The outline I may not use forever. I'm not saying outlines are great, but when you're starting out, you're probably going all over the place. You don't know how to structure something. I would find an outline and force yourself to use it. Outlines are actually quite difficult,
right?
Especially when you're first starting out. But that way, it at least gives you a flow.
Yeah.
And so at New City Church, as we grow, any new person that preaches at New City Church will be forced to, whether they want to or not, use the outline that we currently use, because at least it sets you up with a flow. It could be terrible. You could be awkward, but at least you know where you're going, and you're not only trying to communicate publicly, but you're also trying to write a message, and you don't know how it works. I could not recommend enough. Use an outline that you're comfortable with to help you get through it, but do not focus on the amount of notes you use in the beginning.
Yeah.
Because this takes steps. The first step is just getting comfortable speaking.
Yes.
You will freak out if you have no notes. You already freak out if you're experienced with no notes.
Right.
So one step at a time. Don't worry about it.
It's good.
So hey, if you have future questions about church planning or preaching, practicalplanting.com/questions. We'll go over it in a future episode. Again, if you like that podcast or the show on Facebook or YouTube, make sure you share it with your ministry friends.
Yeah.
And until next time, we'll see you on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.